اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. Read in the name of thy sustainer, who has created humankind out of a germ cell. Read, for thy sustainer is the most bountiful one, who has taught the use of the pen, taught humankind what it did not know. This is the message that Muhammad, the Meccan, illiterate, once orphan, heard in the cave of Hira. If the message was just to read, it would not have made that much of a fuss or excitement had the man been literate, had the place been lit, and had there been a sheet or a book to read. However, none of that was the case in that reality. The man was illiterate, the cave was dark, and there was nothing to read from. And that's why this very command to read, or according to some interpretations, to recite, makes sense as it does not make sense. It doesn't make sense because of the circumstance. And so long as your perception has locked up into this reality, it does not make sense to expect an illiterate man to read from nothing to read in a dark cave. However, that very apparent irrelevance of it made it relevant because in it the hidden message was that this message is from another reality that may or may not make sense in this reality. But you have no choice but to understand and acknowledge that all things may or may not be defined by the reality in which you live. And the message indeed was from another reality, from another world. It was the divine contacting the human, connecting with the human, giving a sense and a message and a purpose to human existence. This one human being was chosen to be the recipient of the message, not for himself alone, but for all of humanity. Now, in the course of human history, how often people have tried to create gods of their own perception in frustration when they are incapable of understanding or detecting the ineffable. In that attempt, through frustration, we have sometimes lowered God to the human level, to a level where we could comprehend some sense of it. Not that the true God, however that may have been defined, deserved to be lowered, but the necessity of the human yearning and the acknowledgement of the limitations of the human perception made it a must. So gods were lowered, gods were personified, gods were humanified, if we can coin the word. And then it may have given the humanity a sense of comfort that there was an immanent God, immanent in its closeness so that they could relate to. But then it defied the transcendent God that need not be brought down because we can't reach high. Yes, there were alternatives in which, if they left the divine in its own realm up high, and high only to imply distancing it from where we live on this earth. So then they would elevate a human to the level of God to shorten the distance. So many became gods through the power of the sword and sometimes the power of the pen, and sometimes through the power of the word, sometimes through coercion, sometimes through its sheer necessity. Humans had been elevated to become gods, to fill the space, to shorten the distance, to reach where they could not reach otherwise through their rational sense. Whichever alternative, when either God was reduced to other than God, or when human was lifted up from a position of other than human, the humanity of the human and the divinity of the divine were both betrayed. They were betrayed because humans became slaves to the whim of their perception, and they couldn't fathom, they couldn't bridge the gap. And then came this message that we just shared. And this message kept the divine as divine, beyond the reach of human perception. That is the transcendent God, the God, and left the human at the level of its humble humanity. Nothing more. Not a rank, a degree. Not a base of power. Not a source of wealth, but any human, and an average human, and in this case, an illiterate, once orphan, in a desolate place like Mecca. The message has other layers in addition to that. When it says that he or it, that is the divine, who has taught the humankind the use of the pen and taught the humankind that which it did not know. There is significance in reference to the pen, aside from the fact that it contains the mysterious letter Qaf, signifying infinity, which is a whole other discussion unto itself. But the symbol of pen is that it distinguishes and dignifies humanity through its most significant feature, and that being the human ability to acquire knowledge and wisdom, not merely through his or her own experience, as is the case with most animals, but rather through the cumulative experience of generations and generations of humans of many cultures who may have delved into the area of trying to know the unknowable. And that knowledge and wisdom is then recorded, protected, and shared with subsequent generations that make the average person in our times perhaps as wise as some of the great philosophers of the past. And that is possible only through the pen. One may wonder that I, for instance, am reading more into the symbolism and metaphor of the pen, also implying that perhaps the use of the pen in the very first revelation may have just been an accidental case. Not so, because in the next revelation, the Quran starts with the same symbolism of the pen. Noon wal qalam wa ma yasturun. Consider the pen and all that they write wherewith. This revelation, considered the second revelation, and by some the third, contains the same symbolism of the pen. But more significantly, it starts with the first of its isolated letters that some believe have encoded messages, and others don't even bother to think. But why the pen And why noon? You may remember I just talked about Noon, the goddess of the underworld that showed the darkness. And from that darkness came the light of the sun that rose on the eastern horizon the next morn. Any resemblance? Yes. Not only is the metaphor clear, but the parallel is very clearly established. And here is the parallel. A pen writes with ink, and the ink is black. It's dark. It traces its own path on a white piece of paper or papyrus, as may have been the case. So it's from the darkness of the dark ink of the pen that comes out light, as in enlightenment and wisdom and knowledge. So as the pen traces its own path on the surface of a papyrus that obviously comes from Egypt, it parallels the movement of Nun, the ancient Egyptian goddess of the underworld, moving slowly underneath from west to the east and taking with it, carrying with it, the sun. Papyrus? Coincidence? Perhaps. But the significance of the first isolated letter, Nun, which perhaps synchronistically or coincidentally is the same sound of Nun, the ancient Egyptian god of the underworld. But in Arabic, the Quranic symbolism of the Nun strengthens this argument more, in the sense that just as the pen is a symbol of the cumulative knowledge, just as the pen shows symbolically, mentioning the darkness and the Meccan surrounding of the time, or the darkness in the cave. And then comes the significance of the letter Nun, which at one level is a letter in the Arabic alphabet, Nun. And it's shaped like a U, the letter U in the Latin alphabet, with a dot in its middle. So we'll come to that significance. But let's continue with the other meanings that this word implies. Nun means the fish. The fish is in the constellation of Pisces, one of the dark months of the year. That's Nun. In Arabic, it's Hut. Nun also means a whale in the sea. And Nun is also the name of a well-known prophet, Jonah. Do you see the connection? Jonah was not strong-willed or strong enough to take the challenge to guide people onto the right path. Scared, indecisive, bewildered, or simply not having the courage and the willpower that he should have, is swallowed by a whale. And in the whale, in the belly of the beast or in the belly of the whale, Jonah makes a desperate wish or a promise and perhaps a commitment. Of course, after realizing that he had lived a life in futility, but then he hopes that if he could live another life, if he could relive, if he could survive the ordeal, imagine under the circumstance when he is in the belly of the beast. So his promise is that he will become a different person than he was. He promises a transition. He promises that we will have the strength and the willpower to guide those who are in the dark into the light. And the Quran has a verse that pretty much prescribes that, or rather it describes the situation of people who may be in such a predicament. Allahu waliyul ladhina amanu yukhrijhum min adh-dhulumati illa an-nur. God is near unto those who have faith, taking them out of deep darkness into the light. This could describe the predicament of Jonah, but perhaps of us as well. The other significance of the whale is that a certain organ of the animal is used as the source for ink. Perhaps they dried and turned it into a powder and mixed it with water, and then it became ink. But the other significance is that noon also means inkwell. As we do calligraphy recreationally for the fun of it now, it used to be the only medium for writing and recording significant narratives in the lives of people at the time. So every which way you look at it, the symbolism of darkness is there. And the concept of transition from darkness into the light, whether it's the Egyptian goddess that carries the sun across the waters in the underworld to the east, or if we look at it in this sense, that whether this symbolizes whale, the darkness in the water, but you could equally say the underwaters, as whales do swim down under, not in Australia. But it could also be the inkwell. It could be the constellation Pisces, another symbol for hood or whale, which is in the darkest month. And so therefore, this contrast between the white and the black, the dark and the light, is hinting to an enlightenment where we do have a contrastive perception or image, not too different from that of taijutsu or tigu that they use in Zen Buddhism. There too, you see two fish chasing each other. They each have an eye looking for the light, and each is defined not just by itself alone, but in contrast with the other. The white defines the black, and the black defines the white. So you see, there is plenty of universality to the contrast of the ink, whatever they may symbolize to you at the cultural level. There is a deeper level of knowing things through them. And in this juncture, it is perhaps worth it that we go deep within ourselves and try to understand where we stand in respect to the symbolism as they affect our lives, as they help us form our own perceptions, one way or another, through worship or through supplication. And this is a good opportunity that we chant the call. So let's hear it.
Vjera tvoja, Resule, moje srce povede do izvora Kevsera, želje moje iz snova, do izvora Kevsera. Tamo sam napustila ovog svijeta prizemna, duša moja slobodna, Allah, Allah doziva, Allah, Allah doziva. Kerimu, ja Allah, za tobom ja izgaram. Šehadetom rodim ja, do tebe moj hak Allah. La ilahe illallah, Muhammed Rasulullah. La ilahe illallah. Šefaat očekujem, moj Resule, od tebe. Suzom svojom od aška selam šaljem iz srca. Suzom svojom Mustafa. Ja Rahmanu, ja Allah, ja Rahimu, ja Allah, ja Muđibu, ja Allah, za tobom ja izgaram. Ja Muđibu, ja Allah, za tobom ja izgaram. Ja Rahmanu, ja Allah, ja Rahimu, ja Allah, ja Muđibu, ja Allah, za tobom ja izgaram. Ja Kerimu, ja Allah, za tobom ja izgaram. Ja Kerimu, ja Allah, za tobom ja izgaram.
Of the dark, from the dark. You come in the dark and steal my thoughts, leaving me instead with your imagination. Recompensed robbery, the loss of the night's awakened soul keeps me still, oblivious in darkness absolute. Where art thou? This is a wandering thought. We all go in search of that darkness when the dark ceiling of your bedroom may turn into a dark slate wherewith the pen of your mind you start tracing things you're trying to understand. So don't worry about looking up there. It makes a lot more sense of looking within. These darknesses are very nurturing for the human imagination. We have used it in religious context. We have used them in the narratives of many of our heroes, historical, sometimes political, and sometimes cultural and literal. If you thought we were done with the darkness, you were wrong. We have the greatest story in the Muslim culture, that of Layli and Majnun. See the resemblance? Etymology comes to help us. Layli is a name, a feminine name, but it means of the night, which is the darkness. And it's that darkness that gives birth to what? To love. So Layli was the beloved of the dark with the dark eyes. And Qais, whose real name has become irrelevant. What matters more is not that what he was named, but rather what he became in this transformation of the heart, where he traded his sanity for the deep love of the divine supreme that happens to represent itself in the beauty of another being, Layli. So Qais became the Majnun. What is at the end of Majnun? We still have the Noon. We still have the inkwell. We still have the Hut, the fish. We have Jonah. We have the underworld. And in the beginning, we have the the meme. What do we have in the middle? Junoon. That is insanity. Insanity because in the sense world, our limited sense define our reality with its own constraints. Therefore, the mere fact that we have perceived the reality with limited senses, we can only conclude then that it is not the reality. Getting out of it will drive you mad, as it drove mad Qais. He was crazy and crazily fallen head over heel about this beautiful woman, Layli, to a point where it's reported that in his being driven mad, he was driven out of the town. He was wandering the deserts, and he was calling the name of his human beloved, Laila, 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 which when chanted in repetition becomes the name of God, the divine feminine. which was he worshipping? Or does it matter? But the test came when once he was wandering aimlessly, or at least seemingly aimlessly, in the desert, deeply lost in the thoughts of the only beauty he had seen with his human eyes. And he passed by a traveler who had parked his camel and was busy praying. The etiquette demands that you do not walk across the path that might cut between a praying person and the direction of Kaaba in Mecca that he or she's facing. But Majnun apparently violated that etiquette. And at this point, the wanderer who was praying got so upset seeing that a grown-up man had not learned his manners. So he interrupted his prayers and called on him in perhaps some derogatory language, telling him that he was not a man of manners. How could he cross in front of a man who is praying to God? And Qais, or Majnun, turned back, apologized, and told the man that he was sorry, that he didn't notice. But then he added that he wondered how was it possible that he, Majnun, being lost in the love of Layla, not knowing where he was going and what he was passing by, and this traveler who was supposedly worshipping God Almighty was still distractible and could not pay attention and could see something other than God and being disturbed by it. Whereas Majnun was so lost in the love that his attention would not go astray. So if we look at it in that sense, there are narratives, there are mysteries, there are mythologies, there are scriptures at different cultural level, and all of them are emphasizing this one thing, that the metaphor of black and white is not a mere contrast of colors, but a contrast between the truth and falsehood, a contrast between a reality that may be perceived and a reality beyond perception, and that it demands that we go from one to the other, because it's in the transition that we find ourselves. The transition could be in space, on the land, in the geographic domain. And indeed, the great ones had to break their cocoon. Yes, Muhammad went from his town in Mecca to the highest mountain cave in the neighborhood, a transition. Later in life, he would transition one more time, going from Mecca in the south to Yathrib in the north. And these two transitions are parallel, because just as the first transition in the dark cave of Hira give that mountain the name of Jabal an-Nur, the mountain of light, the mountain upon which light descended from on high. And the same attributes, the same literal attribute, will be given to the city of Yathrib, who, after this social, political, cultural, and spiritual transition, was renamed as Medina, the Republic, the pluralistic state, the community of all faiths. But its second attribute was, just like in Jabal an-Nur, it became Al-Madinatul Munawwara. Medina, the illuminated, the enlightened, because there, in the political sense, a revolution began. This revolution was advocated by great thinkers such as Plato, who called for a republic in which there should be a philosopher king. But what Plato spoke of, Muhammad implemented in action. And as the great Muslim thinker Al-Farabi would have it, he added a third dimension to the philosopher king by changing it to the philosopher, the prophet, the king. A pioneer pluralistic society that indeed was an enlightenment when they ended hereditary rule, when they decided not to have kings and princes anymore, long before the French Revolution, long before the American Revolution, and every other revolution, came that peaceful revolution when the Prophet of Islam established the first pluralistic community of the faithful, and that enlightenment became the name of the city, Al-Madinatul Munawwara. So, going from the darkness to light, how many darknesses do we see to try to deflect our egos off of them so we can find our path? We have Adam and Lilith. We have Majnun and Layli. And then we go to the greatest of these darknesses, which is the darkness of the night, in which the first revelation occurred. And that's why that cave and that mountain were called Jabal an-Nur, because it's the site of the human empowerment by divine revelation, the night of power, Laylatul Qadr, or the night of destiny. In Arabic, the word Qadr has the dual meaning of destiny in the sense as to where we are destined to go, and the night of Qadr as power, that we have been empowered. That night, or its replication through individual experience, is being sought by many Muslims, generally believed to be occurring in one of the odd nights of the last third of the month of Ramadan, in which we are now. I wish for you that night to have occurred is a blessing, but to hope for its occurrence is even better, because in some sense, the very expectation of having lived the experience of connectedness, or perhaps a reconnectedness with the divine. Mind you, we are not talking about a personified or a humanified God. Rather, that we keep the divine not only in its place in view of our perception, but that we understand that God to be, as the Quran says, unlike anything you can think of, beyond the human perception, which takes us to the second understanding of the divine from an Islamic mystical perspective. There we talk about a God that is at one and the same time eminent and transcendent. Eminent, so you can feel that God as the divine beloved, that your relationship as an individual being with the divine ought to be based on one and only one principle, and that is the principle of the divine love, the eminent, but also acknowledging that the divine is transcendent beyond all these realities that we can perceive. And with that thought, that I hope your thinking could oscillate between the transcendent and the immanent, that on that dark slate above you, when you go to meditation or prepare to sleep for the night, the dark night, I hope you wake up to unenlightenment. Peace and blessings.
اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ